Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. The Michigan Fiber Festival, Michigan's largest sheep and wool festival, is a vibrant world of fiber arts. Discover 5 days of classes with nationally recognized teachers in spinning, weaving, placemaking, dyeing, felting, and rug hooking. Enjoy 3 days of shopping, delight in shearing and fiber arts demonstrations, and enjoy a truly immersive experience. Join us in August at the picturesque Allegan County Fairgrounds. You can even camp on site. Find more details at michiganfiberfestival.info. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Marrow. Sara Bixler is a weaving designer, artist, and teacher. She founded Red Stone Glen as a fiber arts studio, teaching facility, and retail shop in York Haven, Pennsylvania. Sara, thanks for being with me.
Thank you, Anne. I'm glad to be with you.
So we are here in York, Pennsylvania at Weave Together, and we're pretty much just down the road from Red Stone Glen.
That's right. About 20 minutes away.
I think in the last 10 years or so, there have been so many weaving stores and spinning stores closing that it sort of feels like this wave. And you did something that bucked the trend. You started a new store. Can you tell me about starting a new store?
I do. I love telling this story because it requires telling some back history as well. I'm very lucky to be a second-generation weaver, and I actually worked at the Manning's Hand Weaving School, which was another weaving institution based out of Adams County, Pennsylvania. And the Mannings had been around and had established a really great community of weavers in the Mid-Atlantic region. And with the closing of that school, we really wanted to maintain the curriculum that we had developed, the community of weavers. And so it was very much a necessity for us to start looking at starting something brand new and bringing all those weaver back together.
So I love you talk about, I'm going to ask you to tell the story about starting a woman-owned store and having all of these support come to help you.
Sure. In starting a business, I have to admit, when you don't have any formal training in owning a business, you have to rely on previous experiences as well as using all the resources around you. And I was very fortunate that I found that there were a lot of people who wanted to support me. They knew this mission was important, but it was certainly challenging when you propose a business structure like this to a bank for a traditional mortgage or business loan. It's very hard for them to imagine how this could be a profitable business or something that is worthwhile because there's not really a baseline of comparison with other businesses in the area. But in writing my business plan, I not only talked to people in my periphery who had legal experience and financial experience, but other studio owners. In fact, I remember having a phone conversation with Madeline Vanderhoot and saying, should I do this? Is this worthwhile? And she was very excited and said, yes, we need more. So I felt like the rest of our community was behind me too.
But I think feeling like there's a need for something and feeling like I'm going to step in and do this and take on the risk.
Yeah.
That's a big thing.
It is a big thing because it meant rearranging our whole life. Of course, our studio is designed that the studio and our home are located on the same property. And so it needed to work with our growing family. It needed to work with the type of classes that we were offering, not just a few hours on a Saturday afternoon, but sometimes people are staying with us for nearly a week at a time. So finding the right location that gave them more of that retreat-like atmosphere where they were also learning at the same time was a key component in building the studio.
So do you think of it as a studio?
I do. I really do. The studio itself, we have a lot of local people that also come in and take advantage of it. We've expanded our program to independent studies where folks will come and there's no instruction going on, but they're using our equipment and our facilities. And with the retail store component added onto it, we do have drop-in customers that will plan projects with us, talk to us about equipment issues that they're having, and a various sort of a range, or I should say, a varying amount of different things that we're doing on a daily basis.
And you say we because it really is not just you. I mean, you
That's
are
correct.
you are the leader. It's sort of your business,
Yeah.
but it's not just one person.
That's exactly right. So I was fortunate in this endeavor to have a teacher on hand right away, my father, Tom Knisely, who was a full-time teacher with me for many, many years. But I also now have my husband involved. We purchased Bluster Bay Woodworks, and so he is now manufacturing weaving tools and carrying on Terry Laval's traditions. And so it's nice to have basically a family effort pulling this whole business together.
Sometimes wondered how to talk about the fact that your dad, Tom Knisely, is a really well-known
Yeah.
weaver and teacher because you are a weaver with interests in your own right.
Sure.
And obviously, though, there's no denying there's a connection there.
Certainly, yeah. All of my foundational studies I learned from him, certainly. I grew up, like most weavers, with a loom as the central part of our home right in the living room. And I was exposed throughout my entire life with a wide range of different types of textile making traditions. It was a point of discussion. It was always a point of interest to talk about the countries that they originated from or the special tools or the special looms that were used to make them. Yeah.
How did you wind up coming back to it? Because I understand that this wasn't necessarily what you studied.
Correct. I think like most kids, when you go off to find yourself as a college student, I knew that I wanted to enter into the fine arts, but you sort of have an opportunity to do a sampling of a lot of different mediums when getting your fine arts degree. And I really became quite enthralled with ceramics. I love the physicality of it, the textural sort of quality of the clay, and that transformation into a hard object from something very soft. But as that life happens, when I left college, we moved around quite a lot. It was difficult to take a kiln and a pottery wheel with you. It was hard to have an apartment with those sort of hobbies. But I could take a loom with me. And this was something that I carried with me my whole life.
It's so funny. You don't usually think of a loom as being the more portable option.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I loved sharing with people when Dustin and I were much younger, my husband. He had gotten a job in Vancouver, British Columbia. And so we moved there with a Toyota Tacoma with a cap on the back, and there was a loom in there. And I packed all of my clothes around the lambs and harnesses. But if I had to choose what was going to be there for me, that made the cut. Yeah. So I had a little Leclerc 22-inch artistat that made its way back to Canada.
Wow. Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
And you have kind of a variety of weaving interests, right? I mean, I know you as somebody who has done a lot of rigid heddle, et cetera, but pretty broad interests.
Yeah. At our studio, we like to give a wide range depending on the interests of our student, which meant that I had to develop skills that made myself more versatile as a teacher. So on any given month, I might be teaching band weaving, rigid heddle, spinning, or multi-harness weaving. But we tend to stick to a curriculum that is less than 8 harnesses, more simplified structures. We certainly cater to the hobby or home weaver with a small percentage of folks who are actually using this as a full-time career or doing skill development, or occasionally college professors will come for continuing education. Mm-hmm.
And I think it seems like not fair to be talking about this when, unfortunately, not as many people will come to visit your store as will hear about it.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's a really special place. You know, you kind of come to it through these winding roads that are over,
tree covered.
Yeah, and there's trails and all the.
Yeah, we always sort of think that there's a special energy as you sort of descend this very steep hill into what we refer to as the Glen. And you really feel like everything kind of shifts. It's very peaceful. You're surrounded by woods. There's a nice big open meadow and a creek called the Caughnawaga that runs in front of our house. And with those elements sort of combined, you feel like you're sort of cut off from the regular world so that you can really focus on what you came to do. But civilization is only a few miles away.
It feels like being in a tiny campus.
It does. Yeah. And, we feel really fortunate that things sort of aligned as they were supposed to. And after purchasing Red Stone Glen, the property just adjacent to us became available for purchase. And it sort of answered all of our dreams and wishes to then offer housing for our students while they're there studying. It was nice to have bed and breakfast and hotels in the area that would extend corporate discounts, but to be able to stay on site is wonderful. So now we can house up to 8 folks, and that's really lovely. We like hearing the stories in the morning of staying up late and getting to know each other after class hours.
Yeah, one of my colleagues just loved coming and rambling through the trails
Good.
around the property too.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. We always hope that people take advantage of the outside spaces as much as the inside.
And I'm not sure whether this is the same as the building that you make your home in, but
Yeah.
you walk in and there's like looms set up in this
Yeah.
kitchen, and you know, oh, help yourself to a bottle of water.
Yeah. We want people to feel like if they're going to be there for multiple days, that they feel like they're at home. And homes very much fit within our own spaces. And so we didn't want it to feel industrial. We didn't want it to feel institutional. They will occasionally see after school my kids running through. Sometimes they'll pop in and see what they're working on. And occasionally there's a dog that checks in to see what's happening.
So no pressure, but given that you are a second generation and your kids are on site, are your children taking up weaving too?
You know, it's funny. Both of my girls, I have an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old, both of them really show an interest in textiles. The eldest, she knits and she weaves, but we don't put a lot of pressure on it. We certainly don't do formal classes or training, but if there's intrigue or there's a spark of inspiration, I will certainly provide whatever resources are needed. Sometimes when there's a warp left over, they'll sit down and weave off the rest of it. But, you know, they're most typical little kids that there's a lot of things for them to be interested in this point. So I just cross my fingers and hope that it will hopefully be carried on.
This part of Pennsylvania has a long tradition of certain kinds of textiles, and I think of it as being overshot and coverlets and traditional structures.
Sure.
But you also, you know, you talked about inkle, but you also, do rigid huddle weaving. I think one time you had a class on triaxial weaving.
Yeah, exactly. I think that there's this fascination that folks have that they just want to know how it all works. They want to see it all come together. And sometimes those foundational things like triaxial weaving, we can tie back to other industries or crafts like quilting. We look at things like shaker cheese baskets that are triaxial woven. But to have a new understanding of a structure and just look at it a little differently is I think a fascination for a lot of folks, even if they try it once and it doesn't become their new thing.
And there's these shaker stools, which are, I think it's really interesting that there are these sort of meta, weaving with rags. So something that's woven is being woven again.
Exactly.
Shaker stools, woven tapes being woven into a chair.
Yes. I love teaching that class because the shaker weaving stools, which is what I'm actually teaching here at Weave Together, is sort of a combination of looking at the society, right? The shaker communities, their history, the material usage, and we have an opportunity to look at it from all different perspectives. You can just be a crafter that wants to weave a stool, or you can look at the looms that the shakers use, their materials, and what was unique about their lifestyle. And that is also a class that I find very accessible to any weaver, depending on their skill level or no skill or no previous experience.
And it doesn't really require a loom, right?
No loom required whatsoever.
Or rather, the loom is the stool. That's the thing holding tension.
That's our frame. And So, and those are also those takeaway classes. You could do it once, find it very interesting, have something really wonderful that you can love and enjoy. And maybe it's a one-off. Maybe it's something that sparks an interest and you start refinishing furniture and doing on a larger scale for full-size chairs. You just never know. I've had students go on after the class and send me pictures that they went home and inkle wove tape bands and redid a stool that they had repurposed or refurbished, which I thought was just wonderful to see how they took it to the next level.
We've been talking about kind of being rooted in place, but one of the things that you're doing lately is taking people on these travels overseas. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I feel like this partnership that I have with Opulent Journeys has been a nice balancing act for me in my life. When you work where you live, it sometimes feels very insular. You don't have that daily commute or engagement with people from the outside. But part of my textile journey is better understanding the origins of where those making techniques came from. And I find that a large percentage of my student base shares those same intrigue, same interest levels, and really would like to look at travel through the eyes of just textiles and their making processes. And I find it really intriguing to go to the origin place, learn about the society themselves and what their motivations or what the resources available are that develop these textiles.
And I mostly know it as Opulent Quilt Journeys, but it's not just quilting. They're doing other things. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. When they first reached out to me, their origins were in quilt tours and embroidery tours, but they saw in the industry that there was a need for expansion, that there were things among needle arts, crochet and knitting, weaving and spinning tours. And they give me a lot of freedom to put the tour together based on my audience. What would my folks be interested in? And the partnership is wonderful because they've got the resources to find us the best hotels and the best bus companies to use along the way. And so I really value their insight and partnership. But when I look at putting a tour together, again, want to make sure that they get the full cultural experience. So sometimes in addition to hands-on workshops, we'll be doing things that are culturally prevalent. For instance, our next trip to Japan, we'll be visiting a green tea plantation because it's harvest season and having a traditional tea ceremony, something so iconic to Japan.
But I think sometimes it must depend on the place whether you can find weavers easily.
Yes, sometimes that's quite challenging depending on the region that we're in. And outside of weaving, sometimes we'll extend it. For instance, if we're in Switzerland, we might be looking at lace making traditions. If you were in Morocco, we might be looking at button making traditions. But in that, I think that there is enough connections, and many of our folks are not just weavers. They're also quilters, they're also knitters, and they find fascination in the making process.
But I think connecting with people and trying to find people who are traditional handmakers and to some extent weavers. I mean, when I went to Mexico and met people who were doing tapestry weaving, it's a different kind of weaving, but it's not silver making or something like that.
Correct. Yeah. Depending on where we're at, some communities are really set up. They understand that the tourists are interested in learning, at least an observational standpoint, and purchasing some of their handmade crafts. In other regions, they still have institutes set up where people are practicing in community type studios. Some, there are individuals working. And so to bring a group of 20 to 25 people in and say, could you offer us a workshop is often very challenging. And we'll take some negotiating, sometimes dividing our group up into small and compromising on what we can actually accomplish. Sometimes we just get to sample and take a little piece home. But just to sit at a loom that was made right there in the village where we're sitting and using materials that were grown right there in the same town is really special. And not many people have an opportunity to experience that.
My husband and I have a bit of a joke about how I make him go to all sorts of textile places. And one time he was in Japan, in Yonaguni, which is the farthest out island. It's practically Taiwan, And I said, "Oh, well, you know, there's a particular kind of weaving in town." And he said, "I'm not going for you to vicariously be a tourist." But he found a weaver, and she didn't speak a word of English, but demonstrated what she was doing. And he had to go back, and he took. Probably she would have thought, this is made by a child, but I took she took a towel that I wove on a rigid heddle and a copy of the magazine that it was in. Here you go.
And I think that's really sweet that he made that extra effort. The language thing is always something really wonderful for me to point out to folks because it doesn't matter what country you're at. You stick two weavers next to each other and there doesn't need to be words spoken. Just the power of observation and replicating the actions of the teacher or the master next to you. I think that there's a lot of unspoken language that happens. And when our group goes there, I think it's always interesting for the other weavers to have that light bulb moment of, these guys are actually weavers. They know weaving. These are not tourists, and they're really interested in what we have to share with them. And then all of a sudden, they start pulling out more samples, and they start showing more complicated techniques because they can see that we're hungry for more.
Yeah.
How
do you decide where to go?
Some of it is personally, selfishly motivated. Most of it, though, is listening to people around the studio. What are their dream places they'd love to go to? And some of the more far-reaching places, Indonesia, Japan, they're sometimes more hesitant to travel to those places on their own compared to Scotland or England, that are in closer proximity. And so having someone who can curate a tour just to their interest level and say, yes, I will hold your hand. We've got a language interpreter. Everything is figured out. Gives them real peace of mind. And they know that they're touring with not just people off the streets, but other like-minded individuals that are there for the same reason.
And you're not going on the 1 week of the year when they all close to go to something else.
No, everything is very well planned out. I do have to say that this story I love sharing because my very first tour that I did with them was to Scotland. My husband and I arrived in London the day before just to do a day of touring and take the train up to Edinburgh to start our tour. And we got notification while we were in London that the Queen had passed away.
Oh, wow.
And what that meant for us was that in Scotland, every museum, church, National Institute would be in public mourning for 10 days. So I'm feverishly working with the tour company to rearrange this 10-day tour that we had perfectly curated. And I thought if this wasn't a test for my first trip, I don't know what is. But we ended up having a wonderful tour, and they were able to experience something that no one at home was going, which was, standing right there on the Royal Mile as she was taken to Holyrood was quite emotional and historically impactful for folks that they were standing there and taking witness, regardless if the original tour had sort of been rearranged. Yeah.
Well, it makes me wonder whether people were also bringing out traditional textiles that, they wouldn't have worn necessarily these handmade items, but it was a special occasion.
Yeah, sometimes it depends on where we're at. I do find that in many countries, we can still seek out places where traditional costuming is still being made. Mm-hmm. If I can find a place that's accessible, I like to take sometimes people on little shopping trips. Like in Norway, back in Norway, we went to see how traditional bunads are put together. And they talked about how the embroidery...
What is that?
The bunad is like a traditional dress.
Okay.
And often there are vests with embroidery. There's belts. Each of them have symbolism based in the region that they come from. If you're Norwegian, oftentimes you can say, oh, they must be from this area based on the type of silver work that's included. But to see all the fabrics come out and each of us have a chance to touch them and see how they're combined to put a complete outfit together was really special, even from a weaver's perspective. Because, we would compare, okay, the dress is linen, but the top or the bodice is wool, and this is how much yardage is used to construct each skirt is really, really interesting, even if you're not a seamstress.
I think sometimes there's this tension between I want to go everywhere and see everything and bring everything back. Yeah. And also there is something particular about that place and that culture that if I don't want to have all of those. I want to have all those things, but I don't want them to be available right next door necessarily. But is that selfish?
Yeah. No, I think that's a very fair thing to ask. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're talking about these sort of making traditions and going and visiting with folks. And in our modern era, I sort of have to filter things out sometimes based on what I know like modern economics looks like versus the traditions that we romantically sort of hold on to. Right. And we were talking about Scotland, and I had an opportunity to go to two different kilt shops. One that was very old, sort of down an alleyway. Go in and it looks like they've been operating in the same building for 200 years. Yeah. And it had such a rich authenticity, regardless of how many inches of dirt were in some area. But in speaking with the head tailors in the back and looking at the age of them, and I'm sort of mentally calculating like who is following you, who is learning these skills to make these traditional tartans into kilts based on the wearer, based on how they want them pleated. And then, as a comparison, to go to this large shop that was purchased by foreign group that financially could take over it, but they're importing polyester versions for tourists. You really, from a weaver's perspective, it's very easy for us to differentiate between the authentic and those that are the tourist knockoffs. But I don't know that the average consumer does. And so I sort of have these fears about the more authentic, the more expensive surviving on for the next few generations, because it's costly, right? Yeah. Not only in the making of the cloth, but in the tailoring. And you have to be of a certain, I would say, financial bracket to be able to afford something of that quality. Right. Yeah. But I just pray that they're continuing to be passed on. Right.
Well, and you talked about people who come to your shop and learn techniques, and some of them do go on to make a profession of it. But a lot of us who are amateurs are the truly appreciate it, right? But don't necessarily have the inclination or skill or whatever to make it a full-time.
Yeah. Well, and it's also it's a hard sell at
Yeah.
this point, right? The financial security of being a full-time working artist or
Hmm.
maker is risky for some folks.
Hmm.
When we travel to other countries, I think there is the much more likelihood of this linear pass down of the traditions and the making styles from one generation to the other.
Hmm.
Certainly with the Industrial Revolution, we saw sort of a pause or a stale made with some of this oral or traditional passing down of skills. We're here in the United States. We as weavers, I sort of think of us as being like a fruit salad of skills. Sometimes we're weaving something that is based in Swedish tradition. Sometimes we're weaving Mexican tapestries.
Hmm.
We are fascinated by so many cultures, but unfortunately, not many of us are still weaving what our grandmothers or great great grandmothers were weaving
Hmm.
before they emigrated to the United States.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, and you're weaving some of the same things that your father maybe taught you, but you also have very different interests.
Certainly,
Hmm.
certainly. But I sort of admire those folks that are continuing to carry down those traditions. At
Hmm.
SOAR back in the fall, you had Lily Hope in,
Hmm.
who is an amazing Chilcot weaver. And to
Hmm.
listen to her show slides and pictures of sitting next to her mother and learning these skills, who learned it from her mother
Hmm.
and using the same traditional materials and the same color usage, that's something that is harder for me to relate to as a multifaceted weaver.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I see that problem with carrying traditions on just as much as well. I had a really fantastic experience a number of years ago to take a group of my travelers to a northern region of Japan where they are still processing rami fiber, or
Oh,
excuse me,
wow.
linden tree bark fiber. And what was really interesting, and it is a UNESCO heritage site, so I highly encourage you to go and visit.
Right.
The problem is that in Japan, there are many folks that are choosing to move to the cities. And so it's been several decades since they've had children in this village.
Oh,
And
wow.
so the weavers that are at this institute continuing to do this and teach it, they're the last ones.
Hmm.
And all of them are in their 60s or older. So unless some small miracle, some younger folks decide to move back,
Right.
those traditions will die with them. And so what the folks have done is they've recorded them. They have tried to record as much as they possibly can. But that's certainly one of those examples where it requires learning it from the time you're a child onward,
Right.
because they're not just processing the fiber, they're training the trees from the time they're saplings to grow to a certain diameter, to trim the branches off, to know what is the best size before harvest, the retting process. And if you haven't experienced it season after season and hone those skills like our farmers do,
Right.
it's hard to regain that without reinventing the wheel.
And the life cycle of a tree is not.
No, it's
You
not
can't.
short.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
like even like a cotton crop. So you have to be deeply invested for generations. So
Nilda Cañapa Alvarez, whom we talked to earlier, saw something similar happen in her area near Cusco in Peru, and fortunately was able to sort of intervene
revive
in
it.
time, and revive
Yeah,
it. Hmm.
yeah. It's hard to convince young people to say this is important to preserve, especially in a country like Japan that is deeply embedded not only in tradition
Right.
and how they've been doing these things for 1,300 years
Hmm.
versus the draw of the city, right?
Right.
Everything is new, runs efficiently, and they see the modern movement going forward.
Hmm.
It takes a very special individual to want to cling to those traditions and stay and practice them and then send them on to their next generation.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
We try not to get too sad about it. Yeah.
Mm,
But I
yeah.
think it's important to talk about for sure.
Yeah. And, important to go and visit and make those connections and
Yeah,
have
absolutely.
that sort of, there's just something special about having all these things kind of run through your hands and meet the people who do them.
I agree. Yeah. And they're all so very specific to the places that we're at. So very specific, from the material usage based on what grows there or is accessible to the accessibility of water.
Yeah, that's true.
Wood, things like that. We have these very different perspectives of how we do the same exact task. Sometimes in a spinning class, I will refer you to how they would traditionally wash fleeces in Scotland. You're in the Highlands. There's no trees around. They're certainly not going to waste wood on building fires to wash their wool.
Oh, right.
So they would do cold process washing and so you have to think about what would have made the most sense to those folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And not everybody can do what we are fortunate to do, which is to have the materials that you want pretty much
Whenever you
at
want.
hand. Yeah.
Yeah. We live in a great time. If you want to get oyster fiber or yak fiber.
Oyster fiber?
Yes. Have you heard of these?
I've never heard of oyster fiber.
Where they're like processing mineral-based things like
Oh.
oyster shells and pearl and I'm
Rose,
not sure about
mint, sea
yes,
salt,
exactly.
those
Those chemical process that turn them into usable fibers. It's a weird and wonderful time, I suppose. But
It is.
I still very much cling to our traditions with linen and cotton and wools. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I mean the natural fibers. There's just nothing kind of like it.
no, I don't. Yeah, and they're very sustainable as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I was curious. We've talked about the studio. Heading back to Red Stone Glen.
Yeah, let's go back.
I was curious. How do you decide what you're going to offer? Because there's a store associated with Red Stone Glen as well.
There is, and it's sort of like what came first, the chicken or the egg. I think of ourselves more as a teaching institution, the studio, than a retail store. And most of what our retail store contains are things that are supporting the curriculum that we're teaching. And so I think you know as well as I that online shopping is very convenient, but we are very tactile people. And there's something that does not replace picking up a physical cone of yarn and being able to compare two reds side by side
Right.
or two navy blues and their subtle differences or to feel the grist of it. And I think that is something that the brick and mortar will never be able to be replaced from a very visual perspective. Now, we try our best to help our customers that are ordering online or they're calling us up over the phone to have sample cards available so that they can have a visual reference as well. But certainly the classes come first before anything with the store.
Well, you have taught classes, speaking of classes, on color and weaving. And I think that's one of the things that's really different. I come to this as a knitter, and color works very differently in knitting, where you have distinct stitches side by side than it does in weaving. And so trying to put together colors and weaving based on a monitor is pretty difficult.
It is. And certainly those of us who have been weaving for a while, we have these experiential sort of things that we take away from projects that we weave. Some people are very good at retaining things like early on, I remember doing this color combination and I will never do it again. We learn from those moments. But along the way, you learn rules. You learned things like the structure will affect my color and how it reacts. The shininess, the grist of the yarn is going to affect those color interactions. And so when I'm working with someone down the shop, that's one of my favorite days is when I'm working with somebody about color choices. And we have this discussion and we start with these sort of bullet points of what are you making? What's important for the washability? What's the structure that you're doing? What set do you think you want to use? And I think it breaks down the decision-making process for them so that there's a much clearer path and less guessing that's happening when it comes to color interactions.
No, and you come to this as someone who learned weaving from a young age, but also, you have training in color.
Yeah.
What's it like trying to teach somebody how to use color?
Oh, I have to tell people in every color theory class that I teach that, yes, I have a fine arts degree and taken several semesters of color theory, none of which prepared me for what I'm doing in weaving. Spending hours mixing pigments together on a palette to try and create my perfect grayscale really has very little to do with weaving and how those threads come together, right? Because we rely a lot on optical mixing versus that physical mixing of pigments. And as I'm working with students, I feel their frustration. I feel that sort of angst behind their decision-making where they really don't know how to decide because they can't anticipate what's going to happen. And so we use some basic tools to sort of better anticipate what's going to happen. We suggest things like doing some samples, GAMPs, or other sort of samplers that help them have a physical reference point. But I think more so there's the psychology of color. And
Mhm.
my formal training, I think, is what really prepared me to be a better artist in this sector. So looking at color relationships and their value, looking at how to create a more harmonious composition, having a range of light, medium, and dark values and which percentages are given to each color. I think that's where I really took most of my formal training and applied it to weaving.
Okay, speaking for myself, asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Does anybody like sampling?
I think a few people do. I think a few people do. And my biggest advice with sampling, because no one wants to deal with the loom waste. You don't want to weave 18 inches and have 30 inches of loom waste. But when it comes to color choices, especially in the weft way direction, just putting an extra 18 to 24 inches on your warp and using that first couple inches to do all your color play is so much more valuable worth of time before you commit completely. Now, we always struggle as weavers to say, well, I don't even know about the warp colors. Maybe those need to change. We sort of have to invest in our education.
Yeah.
And that's what sampling is. You have to get over the financial outlay of the cost of materials and your time. And as a newer weaver, that hurdle of just warping your loom seems like a big mountain to climb. And as you get more experience and more warping under your belt, it feels less tiresome to sample and it looks more like a worthwhile investment of one's resources and time. So to have a more thought out final composition, I would say.
You know, that is so, it has never occurred to me before that materials is really an educational cost. Sampling,
It is.
It's not just a waste. It's
Correct.
This is there was a knitting class I took, an embroidery and knitting class I took with Franklin Habit and had stayed up almost all night weaving these 2 samples, and I got to class and he said, well, we're only going to embroider on one and then you're going to use the other one. And he said, people complain about this, but you like knitting.
Yeah, you do this for fun. Yeah. But sometimes I think that that's the individual, and some people are very process oriented and some are product oriented. There are a percentage of our students that come to the studio that simply they want to use our studio. They want to use our equipment. They want to have someone help them through the planning and execution. And they're perfectly satisfied, but they might not weave again until they come back for another class.
Yeah.
And there is no criticism in that at all. They are definitely product-driven individuals. Sometimes I pull out a tub of samples and I'll say, please apologies, these are samples. You're going to notice the hems are not finished because what I'm looking at is the structure. I'm looking at those color relationships. And then that was my springboard for something that was more well thought out and that I feel confident in my execution that I've made the right choices.
Right. Making a generous sample.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's hard, it is hard. And we're always trying to think of like, what's the best way to skirt around this? Should I do it on a table loom? Should I do it on like a little pin loom to see what's going to happen? And most times I think you're compromising a lot there. Pin looms have their place. We love our pin looms, but doing a pin loom project with a lace weight yarn that you're going to weave and twill might not give you the same representation of those color relationships on your floor loom. Yeah.
That's true. That optical mixing is not,
Correct.
It depends on the scale.
Correct. And sometimes the loom itself has a big influence. I'm certainly not going to get the same beat and coverage on my table loom as I will get on my rug loom, right? Very different setup there.
You have a specific rug loom?
You know what? I tend to use my countermarch looms more for my rug weaving. I do have a few jack looms that I've modified with steel beams underneath the beater assembly just to give them more heft. But my bigger looms, they just have a lot of oomph behind them without having to me physically work quite as hard. Yeah.
I suppose having a studio is one way that one can have a lot of different looms.
Yes. And please don't ask me how many I have because I couldn't honestly answer you at this point.
You know, I've stopped asking in part because of the rise of pin looms.
Yeah.
Since there are pin looms and you could have different sizes, it's just not meaningful anymore.
No. We have, and most people do have an inkle loom, a pin loom, or some small loom tucked in the back of their closet as their travel loom.
So who's counting, really?
Who's counting? Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about weaving in your studio, and here we have enticed you to come just about 20 minutes away to York. But do you teach elsewhere?
I do. So I do love teaching at conferences like this. Generally, we don't teach at conferences that are too close to home because it's just easier to operate out of our own studio. But we do have coming up the Mid-Atlantic Conference, which is our regional conference under the Hand Weavers Guild of America. And I love the regional conferences. This one is based out of Lancaster County. So again, it's only about 45 minutes to an hour for us. And it's our home audience, but it's another one of those places where people can come together and you get big name teachers. I'm also going to be giving the keynote address at CNCH for the Northern California Weavers at the end of April. And so I really enjoy hitting out to the Midwest, the West Coast. I am now teaching every February out on Bainbridge Island. There is a new art center that has been built out there that is absolutely fabulous called Barn. It's the Bainbridge Artisan Resource Network. And the studio that we teach in is actually the Marguerite Porter Davidson studio. It was sponsored by her granddaughter. So it's a really nice new community for me. And then really, Zoom has kind of changed things for me. Like many teachers, I find that the outreach to other groups is so much easier through my computer screen, right from the comfort of home.
Sure. And you've taught various classes for us through video.
Yeah.
And I remember there was you used to have to fly across the country with rigid huddle looms. And so you would put on a warp, take the loom apart, put on another warp. I remember once working with Anita and I was thinking, okay, we're shooting these 3 little videos. So since I have a number of Kromsky rigid huddles, I warped one, took the side frames off, put the back beam that was already beamed and the heddle aside, put a new one together. And basically I took 3 back beams and 3 heddles and just took them apart and put the sides back together. I don't know what TSA thought when they scanned my bag, but well, I brought a bobbin winder through my carry-on, and they thought that was a little weird.
I guess they just, she looks safe enough. Go ahead.
Well, who knows? Or they must just be accustomed to seeing all kinds of weird stuff.
Yeah. But the travel coming out to you guys is so fun because you have such a great professional setup to do the recordings. And folks will often ask me about my partnerships with groups like yourself. And I said, you just do it right. You go out there and you've got a team of professionals who know how to do the sound. They know how, they have all these cameras to give you all the best angles. And I certainly couldn't do it any better.
But you did quite a lot early on, particularly during the pandemic. You had, not only were you offering weaving, but you had a book club. And so that reaching out to folks who couldn't go anywhere.
Right. I felt like a lot of us felt like we needed to reach out to people. We needed to communicate. We needed to connect in ways. And so things like our online book club were really fun for me. It was work, you know, having content prepared each week to do a Facebook Live where you might have 150 people listening to you on the other end and saying, you know, but it opened up discussions. It got us looking at historical things. It got ideas sharing and we really had a wonderful time with it. But shifting to online teaching had its own learning curve to it. You know, if you're not trained in audiovisual stuff, there's a lot of online research that needs to be done in purchasing the right equipment and making sure you've got the right amount of bandwidth
oh my gosh,
stream without interruptions. Those are just little challenges that we powered through and we met our people. We met them online and we connected, and there are times where we still do that on a smaller scale, but I was grateful that it kind of kept things together when we needed it.
When I think about broadband in the Glen, you know, at this point we expect to have broadband everywhere, but you are down a steep road covered by trees.
We are down in the bowl for sure with mountains all around us. But as much as people like to disconnect, we still like to know that we can reach people on the outside and that things feel like they're functioning normally with the rest of society.
Yeah. Sort of turning the other way, embracing the traditional. I wanted to ask you about something else that's kind of very connected to this Mid-Atlantic, which is you're connected with a coverlet museum. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Thank you for asking. Yeah, so I am now standing as the vice president on the board of the National Museum of the American Coverlet, based out of Bedford, Pennsylvania. It's just about an hour away from us, but This museum was started by two collectors. They were antique dealers, and they had a particular interest in coverless, specifically North American coverless, including Canada. And at some point, it was suggested to them that perhaps they should make it available for the rest of the public. And right now, we're standing at about 1,400 coverlets,
Wow.
which is quite impressive. It's something that requires a lot of management, not only in the keep of it, but the inventorying and putting shows together. But antique coverlets is something that I was exposed to very, very early on. And it was something that I found I connected with my father on. I can remember going on sort of loom hunts where we would show up at someone's barn and pull out beams, and he would sort of visually assess that everything was there. And then we had the joy of going home and scrubbing it down and, restoring it. But those looms told a portion of the story.
Right.
And one of the unique things that I love about coverlets is not for me personally making them or recreating them, but it's the one piece of American textile making that has a story attached to it. An American coverlet typically will include in the corner what we call a cartouche. And that cartouche gives a lot of really great information about what the weaver's name was, the year, the county, and possibly the person's name who it was made for. There are no other textiles that we have in our making traditions that gives us that much background information and the story behind the making of the piece, if they were commissioned or if they were just as a saleable item.
Wow.
Yeah.
So is it mostly about just the preservation of these historic ones, or is there something about preserving the techniques as well?
I think both. So if you're ever able to come actually physically to the museum and visit, you'll find that it's a mixture of both coverlets on display that will give you demographic information about the maker or the region. Usually the shows are themed around a specific idea, but there are several rooms that you can move through. There is one room that is set up with a number of barn looms in them. And this gives you sort of an idea of different looms that would have been used during the same time period, from our basic 2-harness loom, because they have some Canadian coverlets that only required 2 harnesses, all the way through to some jacquard heads. And what did those cards look like as the advent of more complex imagery was possible for the home weaver, doing eagles and flowers, and how that imagery became almost trademarked to that weaver or a family group, what was shared between them, and what was popular imagery of that time period. So it tells a broad story. The last room in the back also has a number of textile tools. So they were still hand processing flax at the time. They were still hand carding wool, because we're talking pre-industrial revolution.
Sure.
And so to be able to see those tools and what their uses were is really, really wonderful, especially for the folks coming in that are not textile makers themselves.
Wow, that sounds like something to visit.
It is something to visit. And like most museums that are small and very niche, it takes outreach to sort of say, people other than weavers should come check this out. And this is why it's interesting. And this is something that would have been found in almost every home. Someone would have had a bed covering of some degree. And it's neat to tell the story.
Yeah.
Especially the weavers.
Especially the weavers.
Especially the weavers. I mean, those of us on the board and that visit the museum regularly, we all have our favorite weavers, which is weird to say.
So not
Who's
even
your favorite 1800s weaver?
Not only your favorite coverlet, but your favorite weaver.
My favorite weaver. Yeah. I think that when we talk about our favorite weavers, it always takes our own personalities into account as well. We have a number of coverlets in the collection that were woven by a woman in New England. Her name is Hannah Leathery Wilson. And she's very unique because of her making style. A number of years ago, I did a video for you guys for Rigid Heddle on boutonnet, which is a structure based in plain weave where you bring piled loops to the surface, usually like the crochet hook or some dowel that would regulate the size of the loops. And this is something we saw a lot in the St. Lawrence River Valley area during this time period, but she was in New Hampshire. So we have a lot of questions in regards to how she was exposed to the making technique, why she chose that over multi-harness weaving, because it's very physical compared to the multi-harness structures that could have been accomplished at the same time period. But she was prolific. You know, we've got some that are numbered. She numbered them that are in, I think, 109 9 is
my
the one
gosh.
that I'm thinking of. So she made a ton of these.
Right.
And to be a professional weaver during that time period, I just love her story.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Sara, thank you so much for your time. I'm really excited to head out back to Red Stone Glen and explore some more.
I can't wait to have you back. It's always nice to do stuff with you guys.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.